What is up, Flick fans? Welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking my personal 10 favorite trilogies of all time. Not the best trilogies, not the most high-quality trilogies. Which ones do I go back to the most? Which movies do I prefer to revisit? And which packages work best as a whole for me personally? A lot of things to talk about when it comes to a trilogy because you have 3 movies to consider within each package, if you will. And of course, I'll have honorable mentions, but I need you down below. What are your all's favorite trilogies of all time? Which franchises would you take 3 movies out of and package them as a trilogy? Now, I didn't really do that. Maybe 1 or 2 options on my list. There was one that I'm going to count as an honorable mention that I wanted to put in my top 10, but I see it more so as 3 through 6 are more of a cohesive package than 4 through 6, and honestly, we could get into stipulations all the live long day, right? I'm sure you guys will have things that I see and go, oh no, I should have put that in there, but that's what this video is all about. It's the back and forth, it's the discussion, and if you like these kinds of special videos, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. We're going to need to do special videos, because movies, well, there's not going to be a lot of them. We'll focus on Netflix. All right, I'm getting into my honorable mentions, and what I was talking about earlier, Mission Impossible. One of my favorite franchises, now that's a different video, one of my favorite franchises out there right now. And I had some people tell me, Austin, you should do Mission Impossible 4 through 6, but I look at it, and I see Mission Impossible 3 just sticking out like a sore thumb if I don't include it, because I feel like the narrative lends itself to kind of be a part of this story that they're telling right now. And even if you don't look at it that way, you have these new movies coming out that are going right along with what we just got in Mission Impossible 6. So my brain was sitting there frying, and I said, you know what? I'm just going to leave it off the list for right now. It will definitely be talked about in franchises because I love me some Mission Impossible. But as for now, it is an honorable mention. You can also go the Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi route. Of course, you have Spider-Man 3 in there, which takes it off this list entirely. But the first 2, some of my favorite comic book movies of all time, especially Spider-Man 2, and the big one, or the big ones that I'm going to leave off this list, are 1, Indiana Jones. Now, this is not to say I do not like Indiana Jones. I freaking love Indiana Jones, especially the first and the last. Now, that middle move, there's a 4th? Really? I don't remember that. Now, Temple of Doom is what kind of throws it off for me because I never go back and revisit that film. And honestly, it's been so long since I've watched Last Crusade. But Raiders is Raiders. You can't go wrong with that. The big trilogy, though, that I'm leaving off of this list is actually Godfather. I'm leaving off Godfather. And I know I'm going to get it, but once again, these are my favorite trilogies of all time. And even though I love the first 2 movies, I think they're brilliant, some of the best movies ever made, they aren't movies that I revisit. So keep that in mind. And then that 3rd film for me falls completely flat, like completely off the rails. And there will be other trilogies in my favorite trilogies of all time where one of the films is significantly just not as good as the other ones, but I still revisit those franchises more. So those are the reasons why I'm leaving Godfather off of this list. Nothing against the 2 films. Once again, 2 of the greatest movies of all time. And I may actually prefer the second movie. But this is my favorite of all time. A couple of franchises that I consider, but then I was like, nah, it's Thor, but then you have Thor the Dark World, Blade, but then you have Blade Trinity. The closest for me that didn't end up on the list, not one of the ones that I think a lot of people will be upset about, is the new Star Trek trilogy. Because the first one is one of my favorite modern sci-fi films. I love the first one. I actually don't hate the second one. I don't hate Into Darkness, and I was a fan of Beyond. So it is a trilogy that only did not make it because of the level that I love these other movies and the level that I love these other trilogies. But let's stop talking. Let's get right into it. So ad number 10 is How to Train Your Dragon, an animated trilogy. Austin, yes, because I think this is absolutely brilliant for what it did, and the fact that it nailed all 3 movies, in my opinion. Maybe the 3rd wasn't as good as the first 2, but it still did a phenomenal job, whereas some of these other trilogies, even trilogies above it, aren't as consistent as How to Train Your Dragon. I may not revisit this one as much, or I may not look at it as epic as some of these others, but it still deserves to be on here. Toothless and Hiccup, their story, all of these side characters and these side plots, the culmination at the end, a pure ending to the trilogy. And we have those somewhat with other movies and franchises on this list, but this one, I'm pretty confident that it will be the last one. We'll have the TV shows, and who knows? We may throw in a fourth movie later on, but I think it would be brilliant if there was a time skip and we didn't use the same characters. Regardless, I think How to Train Your Dragon is a wonderful animated trilogy. Now, coming in at number 9, this may ruffle some feathers as well, but I have Back to the Future. And a lot of it comes off the strength of that first film and the fact that I actually like the second film as well. I'm just not the biggest fan of the third movie, and I know a lot of people love that third movie, but what worked and worked so well spawns from that first film, the original, the OG, Back to the Future, Marty and Doc. It's the reason why we feel the way that we feel about movies like this in general. It's the reason why we get so upset when people are talking about Tom Holland being recast, even though I think Tom Holland would be perfect as this generation's Marty. We don't need to do that. This is one of those movies you just don't reboot or remake. I feel like this trilogy isn't as consistent as maybe it should have been. I feel like the love for the first movie may overwhelm and cloud some's judgment of the entire trilogy, and that's absolutely fine. That's why this is my favorites list. But I, for one, don't go back to the sequels all that much. I rewatch the first film all the time. It's actually been a bit. I need to get back to that. But as a trilogy, it comes in at number 9. Still number 9. I still love this franchise, but I didn't put it any higher on my list because I have, and just looking at this without looking at the other films, I even feel in my heart that this is too low. But I have John Wick at number 8. Why John Wick at number 8? Consistency throughout the franchise. This franchise somehow, I'm going to say this, and it's not a negative, it repeats the same formula with every movie, but within that, it also changes things up that need to be changed, and it gives us something fresh and new in every movie while following what works so well about the first, or what works so well about the second. The third one follows, and it just keeps going. It just keeps chugging along. Now, we will get a fourth film, and that will probably make me look at it as something that feels more like 4 movies instead of 3, but right now, it's a trilogy. I think it deserves to be on this list. I love it. One of the coolest, I think it is the action franchise of my generation, the action franchise of the 2010s, and it will hopefully just keep getting stronger. Next up is the Cornetto Trilogy. That's right, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. This is the only trilogy on my list that isn't, by some people's standards, technically a trilogy, but this is Austin's standards, and it's still the Cornetto Trilogy according to the filmmakers. So I'm going to consider it that, and I'm going to put it on this list because these are some of the funniest, best, and most entertaining movies I have ever seen. The way that they play on each genre within each film is brilliant, from zombie movies to cop dramas to literally full-on sci-fi in that third film. It is just so good. Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, they carry this franchise. Every movie is different. They feature different characters and different mentalities for each character, but I love the way that they switch it up, yet they still keep the heart of what they're doing. They still keep that sense of humor and the comedy that works so well. And I know some people will say, well, they're not as funny. They're not as exaggerated as American comedies, but I love British dry humor. I just do. I think it's so brilliant, and the way that these characters are portrayed on screen, they just keep getting better. I would love more movies in this franchise, but if this is all we get, I'm absolutely okay with that. Apes together, strong. Planet of the Apes. Oh my goodness. There have to be some great trilogies. For this to be as low as it is, I mean, my goodness. Andy Serkis as Caesar, let's talk about that really quick, is phenomenal. And the consistency, and here's what I'll say about this franchise, the fact that it, according to some, keeps getting better. Now, my favorite movie in this trilogy is the middle movie, that is Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. It's one of my favorite films of all time. But I prefer Dawn more than Rise. I also prefer War more than Rise. Now, I love all three, and consistency is a big part of why this is as high as it is. But I just think, obviously, the culmination of everything was within Dawn, but I also really love what they did in the other two. Guys, this is just one of the coolest, scariest trilogies you could possibly be watching, but one of the coolest and visually spectacular. I believe none of these movies won for Best Special Effects, Visual Effects at the Oscars, which kind of blows me away because these movies are special effects in themselves, and the motion capture is terrific within these films. And every time I felt like we were getting stale with the plot line or the story was kind of slowing down, something exciting, something crazy would happen. So happy with what Matt Reeves did, especially with this franchise in the final two movies, and I think it deserves to be on my list, no doubt. Next up is the Captain America trilogy, and yes, I could say Civil War is Avengers 2.5, and it kind of is Avengers 2.5, but it still says Captain America before it, so I am counting it, and it is the culmination of Bucky's storyline. So it is continuing on that trend of what they were doing within the first two films, and I think the direction from the Russo brothers continues to get better. Now, I think their best effort, maybe ever, is Winter Soldier. But to bring everyone in like they did in Civil War and still manage to keep the focus on Captain America, I mean, with what happens with Peggy and the fact that Winter Soldier's coming back and the fact that you are on his side for a lot of the movie, maybe not the entire film, but I was at least like, yeah, Captain America, go. A little selfish, but go. I love this character. Most of it comes from Winter Soldier, but the consistency, and I will actually compare this to Planet of the Apes to a T. Because while I like the first movie, I like the second two better, but my favorite, barely, is Winter Soldier. It's exactly how I feel about Planet of the Apes. And I believe the first two movies both came out in 2011, and I was comparing both of those at the time, so it's interesting to see how this shaped out and played out. Regardless, I love this trilogy, one of my favorite superhero trilogies of all time, my favorite on-screen hero character ever, and I love him so much. Now, if we're talking pure quality of the films, you'd obviously have to put Godfather in here because of those first two movies alone. You'd have to put Lord of the Rings, and you'd have to put Toy Story up there. The fact that it's so low, I say so low on this list, kind of hurts me because I think it is the most consistent, maybe the most consistent franchise, and the quality of all three movies are there. I just prefer the three above it because I prefer going back and revisiting those and the entertainment value, but this strips nothing away from Toy Story because two of these movies are amongst my favorite of all time, and there are so many things to love about each of them. They each tell their own story. Wait a second, Austin, Toy Story 4 exists. What are you doing? Well, in my opinion, Toy Story 4 is almost the prologue to the first three films, to the first entry in this franchise, if you will, if they continue on with the storyline set up in Toy Story 4 for certain characters. And it's also kind of Woody's movie, right? Toy Story 3 is the end of the team and the group, and Andy's storyline as we know it. We'll say it's the Andy trilogy. So that's the route that I'm going with this. Regardless, you guys know how I feel about this franchise. Two of my favorite Pixar movies of all time. And I feel like I keep leaving out Toy Story 2. I still love Toy Story 2. I think it's great. I just prefer the other two movies, but they're all three wonderful. Consistency is key with a trilogy like this, and that's why it's so far up my list. Then we have Star Wars. Austin, which one you going with? Is it the prequels? Is it the sequels? No, it is the original trilogy. Duh. A New Hope is great. I love it for what it is. Now, it does move a bit slower than maybe some will like to go back and revisit all of the time, but it gets us set up for Empire Strikes Back, which is my definitive favorite Star Wars film. It is so good. Every moment is memorable, and every moment in A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, they're memorable as well, but Empire just does something different, man. But the movies go together, they fit together so brilliantly. They're like puzzle pieces, and it's not even the fact that they had everything figured out after that first film because, George Lucas had to go back and change some things and fix some storylines, this and that, but it's okay. I mean, if they did it on the go, it's fine. It worked out, as long as it works out in the end, and it's a beautiful trilogy. Now, I don't love Return of the Jedi as much as I do the other two, and I feel like with every trilogy, I'm going to have that one movie that I just don't love as much, and that's my film within this trilogy, but it does the culmination about as well as you can do. It features one of the best space battles of all time, so this trilogy for me means a lot, and even though everything else has just went back and forth, and you could say the sagas and shambles right now, it doesn't matter. This trilogy is important to me, and it works so well upon rewatch to this day. So part of this is because how I feel about The Dark Knight and how much I love the character of Nolan's Batman, the portrayal by Christian Bale, every story featuring villains or a villain that just hit me so hard emotionally when I was growing up. And this is the franchise. I mean, obviously Toy Story and somewhat Lord of the Rings and some of these other franchises, but this is the one that just spanned throughout my life when I was growing up. From 2005 when I was 10 to 2008 when I was 13 to 2012. I mean, that is pretty much most of my childhood growing up with this trilogy. And even though I know some who don't even like Dark Knight Rises at all, and I understand that, I still like it. I think Dark Knight Rises is fun. There are clear issues that are more prominent and more evident than the other two movies in the trilogy, but it still means a lot to me. So this is a trilogy that I love going back revisiting, but not just watching one individual movie. Now, I say that recently I went back and watched The Dark Knight. Okay, normally when I watch these, I watch the trilogy over again. I do Batman Begins, The Dark Knight Rises. I've probably done that 10 plus times. That's a lot, okay? This is the trilogy I go back to. These are characters I care about. And a lot of it has to do with nostalgia. I'll admit that. I have nostalgia for the character of Batman. This is my favorite superhero growing up. These are the comics that I visited the most. This was my Batman movie. Or my Batman movies. I mean, when I was super young, Batman and Robin came out, but that's not good. But this is the one for me. So you're asking why it's as high up as it possibly is. That's why. I mean, I love this character so much. I love this franchise so much. The Dark Knight, one of my favorite movies of all time. Still enjoy The Dark Knight Rises, even though I know a lot of people can point out flaws that I almost agree with. And then Batman Begins, the one that started it all. A brilliant movie in itself. Number 2 on my list. And finally, Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins. Oh my gosh. I love this trilogy so much. And even growing up, I didn't know I loved this trilogy as much as I did because I was so young when they were out in theaters, and I didn't even get to watch the first one in theaters, and finally I watched it, and my parents took me to the second two, but I still didn't have the appreciation then that I have now for this franchise and how epic almost every moment, every character, every idea that goes into these movies are. I mean, it's just pure epic. Everything. And me, not even being the biggest Lord of the Rings fan in this household, my wife is the world's biggest. She loves everything about this franchise. She wanted to go back and revisit them the other day for the first time in about a year. And last year, when we rewatched them, we were obsessed for like a month with Lord of the Rings knowledge, trivia. We're watching the Schmodown. We're watching this and that, just pure Lord of the Rings Middle-earth madness. And now watching them again this year, I'm in awe with how they managed to accomplish this. Make this franchise look so good for the time period and keep the CGI intact with what we see now. This was 17, 18, 19 years ago, and it looked solid, right? Not every shot holds up, but the majority of it does. It holds up to CGI now. Do we know how much CGI has changed? I mean, my goodness, it's so impressive. And then we get the Hobbit trilogy, which I was overall a bit underwhelmed and disappointed by. And the Lord of the Rings movies look even better than the Hobbit movies. It's crazy what they managed to do, from the practical effects to the character development to the extended editions, which we did watch, which amplify the films and make them even better. How do you watch a 4.5-hour movie and it works? I don't know. But this franchise did it. And these movies are amongst some of my favorites of all time. And this trilogy, as of now, I mean, I could change tomorrow, but it is my favorite trilogy of all time. So that's it. I need your comments. I need your lists. I need your thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. What are your favorite trilogies of all time? What are the best trilogies of all time? Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned, because now that we have done trilogies, we will do movies. That list is almost done, and I'll have it to you hopefully next week. You guys are the best. I'll see you soon.